Hey guys, welcome back to the Think on These Things podcast. We are so glad to have you here today. We're looking forward to a great podcast with our friend, Reverend Zach Hammond. Zach Hammond is the student pastor at First Apostolic Church in Maryville, Tennessee. He is the father of two boys and the husband to Lauren. He serves as the National Youth President for the Assemblies of the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the author of two books, one of which we're going to discuss today, and that is Curiosity versus Conviction, The War of Carnal Curiosity and Christian Convictions. And his other book, Proverbs, the Daily Devotional, are both available now on Amazon. We'll link those below. And we are honored to have you with us today, Reverend Zach Hammond.
Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much. It's a honor and privilege to not only be on the podcast that I've been privileged to listen to and learn from multiple times, and but also to be with you guys, great friends, great leaders, and just thankful, honored to be on here. I can't say enough about what I think as a couple you guys are doing for this generation of leadership, and setting such an example and a precedent for leadership in general.
Man, that is very kind of you. We're very excited. We do consider him and his wife and really the whole family great friends. Always been in, one of the hallmarks of our world today that I think is kind of thrown around too loosely is the word Christian, but like incredible apostolic Christians, just great godly people, moral. Yes. I mean, just across the board, incredible. And we're excited to dive into this because this book, as soon as you released it, I picked up a copy. I read through it. I told everybody in our church about it. We've had several people in our church purchase it and read it. A lot of parents recently started a Christian school last year. And so like our principals reading it and showing it and trading it off. But, I want to get a little bit of background on you just for the listeners, for those that may not know you. One of the questions that I'd like to ask is, how long have you been working in youth ministry currently?
In youth ministry, I was at my father's church, grew up in my dad's church in Hammond, Georgia, and I joined the youth team. We had more of a staff for each kind of division, from middle school, high school, and college age. I believe when I was 17, 18, I was a junior or senior in high school, and Dad put me on staff. I was more in a creative role, help with music, those kind of things, events, but I've been involved for quite some time now. So I'm 33, so we can do the math there.
That's a good little 16 years there.
Yeah,
that's a long time. So between now and then, I think, serving on a national level, you see much more. Obviously, the vision's a little bit different, but what do you see as the major difference that our students face now versus what they faced 16 years ago?
I think there's a number of differences. Probably the most glaring ones are what we'll talk about today as far as the internet and social media. And that's probably what prompted me more than anything with the book. But I'd say, we all know that sin always just has kind of a different mask. It's the same root in general, but I think a lot of the issues that we're facing is more and more and more kids that don't have parents leading them. So, as a student pastor, I think there's a whole lot more on the student pastors that I lead, or the youth pastors, or youth presidents, or the districts, or whatever. It's like the thing you're facing is not as much the kids as it is parents and kids trying to partner with parents. Parents are uneducated on the world that the kids are living in and what they're exposed to. It's just a whole other world that they're living in. So I would say the biggest change is how involved. Used to, you and a kid could go, 4 or 5 kids go bowling, have a good time, on the bus ride back, have a conversation. You've connected with them, you've impacted them. Now it's just a different world, like working through the parents, trying to help the home environment be right. Families are not what they used to be. They're not sitting around the kitchen table like they used to be. A lot of those things have changed. So I think we've had to be much more involved over the past, really the past 5 to 7 years with the parents than we have ever been. which creates a whole nother world for student leaders.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that I say a lot from our pulpit. I feel like, and I've said it a lot recently, is that the pulpit cannot reverse what the home condones. Like we just can't fix it. And it's the same thing for, like a Christian school teacher or student ministry. It's just, we get them for a couple of hours. They're at home so much more. We can't reverse that. So I guess, one of the questions that I would have as a pastor is what kind of tactics have you taken in partnering with parents from a ministry perspective to be able to get them, like you said, everybody on the same page and investing in their children again?
So there's so many different avenues to go in answering that. I think, we, from the standpoint of cell phones, all those things, we've started a parent awareness event. We just had our second one at the church. We had a detective come in, speak. I spoke, showed a video. It was about a 35, 40-minute session before our Sunday night service, just to show parents. We had maybe a couple hundred, 250 people show up, and they were just sitting there. Some of them were elderly. Trendsetter is what we call like our senior saints. They showed up because they wanted to know, like, hey, what happens when I delete this app on my phone? Does this stuff still? It's just they don't know. They don't understand it. So that's something we've done to try to partner with parents, educate parents on how to draw lines in kind of this new land of the internet. That's one of the things I address in the book. It's very difficult because we've done a really good job. I feel like you guys, the list is a mile long of apostolic churches with apostolic heritage. Your pastor, your dad, your bishop has drawn lines for us, and those lines have held us in a promised land because it was a protected land. Like we're here because of that, and so I believe that, but I also believe that the students that are living today, they're living by those lines, but that land, it's just like, one of the things, and I'm not speaking this on anybody or anything, but like one of the lines for us when I was growing up is that we didn't go to the movies. With my dad and grandfather, it was a bad environment, terrible place. Just like some people didn't go to the skating rink, whatever it was in your town. Like now, like we don't have any kids even thinking about going to the skating rink or going to that's like the last place they want to go. Like I don't mean that bad, but so some of those lines, it's easy for them to adhere to. So we partnered with parents to try to get to where they're at. Say, hey, your kids are dealing with these things. Every situation we're dealing with, every conversation we're having, it all has to go. It goes back to a phone or cell phone. So that's something we've done to try to partner with them, to have an event, to educate them on how to be the priest of their home. Because I can stand up from the pulpit and say, hey, we don't need to go to this. No. But ultimately, if that parent don't understand how to enforce that or how to keep them accountable, it's just me getting up, just again, trying to resurrect something that they're putting to death in their home. It's like that. There's no way to hold it accountable. So.
Well, and it's good that it's going back to the family, because really and truly adults are struggling with cell phone boundaries as well. And so it's if you address it on a family level, then it's like, hey, mom, hey, dad, you and the kids do it together, like set healthy boundaries as a family, because parents are struggling with pornography. They're struggling with being connected all the time. And that's what our kids are seeing is their mom and dad's on their cell phone all the time. And then mom and dad's like, well, don't be on your cell phone as much. And it's like, what you're doing at mom and dad is like, oh, but I'm doing important stuff, So it's kind of like kids have a hard time regulating that. But if you appeal to the family and say, hey guys, on a family level, let's do this together as a family. Let's set up healthy boundaries. Let's be accountable to each other as a family. Then I think kids feel like, well, it's not just mom and dad telling me to do this. Like they're showing me we're doing it together, and they don't feel alone in that.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. It's you say that, and that's kind of the angle that we've come at it, is that like parents need it as much as anybody. We don't really know. We've surrendered so much knowledge to it, and there's so many convenient factors to it. It's like, what would we do without it? I don't even know if I could. There's certain people I know, like I'm decent with directions. At least that's what I tell my wife. But it's a thing where like I don't know if I could get certain places without it. I know like 4 people's phone number, but we've surrendered so much knowledge to it that how do we put it down, or how do we do without it? It's just convenient. And so we've all got to have those moments where we set it down, set parameters. You know, my wife and I, we keep each other accountable. We have limits now that you can go in on the iPhone to the settings and set limits on how long with social media. At a certain point, it just turns off. Says your limit's been met today. I have to go all the way into the phone settings to turn that back on. You know, because I can justify it a million ways, but I don't want my boys sitting there on it. They're just watching me sit there on it while I tell them to go do something else. You know?
Yeah, and that's true. And I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying. We drew lines that kept us in the promised land, and those lines to some kids today, like you said, they're not tempted by it anymore. But it's kind of like and I keep on using this analogy just because I don't have anything better, I'll be honest. Like back in the day, cars didn't have seatbelts until people flew through windows in a car accident. So they added seatbelts. And it's like the same thing with social media and digital content, and not just content, but the medium through which we consume content. It matters, but we're finding now that it really needs safety precautions. And who better than the church to spearhead that? Because I believe, not to say that other people haven't done it, but other people haven't done it on the scale that you have. You've spearheaded this conversation to talk about this with our children. And it's not conspiracy theory. It's data driven. It is absolutely factual that this is what's happening. And like one of the statistics that you put in the book was that I think it was 8th, 10th, and 12th graders are more likely to feel lonely since the release of the iPhone in 2007. And if we look at that, some people might be like, well, what does that mean? So if you were to talk to a listener and you're like, hey, this is what do you think those statistics are telling us?
I think the church has the ability, I say this quite often, to help us manage the three things that God makes us stewards of: our time, our talent, and our treasure. If I lost my house today, I'll figure out a way to get another house. I lost my car today, I figure out a way to get another car. There's things that are replaceable. Time's not one of them. Once time's gone, I don't get that time back. And I think students are living, and majority of their time is spent on these things. And so it's statistically, I think they feel like they're connected in this virtual world. They're spending all this time with people, but ultimately it's not real. So I think the feeling, I know that's a very obvious answer, but the feeling of depression is that they're trying to live a real life in a fake world. So it's not, that's not a real, response. I teach a series in our youth, and I've done it. For some reason, they love it. Like, I keep going back to it. Like, we need to hear it again. Like, I've taught it 4 times now. But I just talk about what it means to laugh. Like, the accepting factor of laughter. Like, that's how ultimately Hollywood has brought in a lot of the things they have, is by making something that's unacceptable a comedy. So we talk about just a simple text of me sending back to you, if you send me something to say LOL. Well, I'm not really laughing out loud 90% of the time. I'm sending you a cry face emoji turned sideways, and I'm not really doing that at all, But the fact that I send that to you sends an emotion from me to you that makes you feel like that I've responded the way that you wanted me to. So there's, even in the small conversations that we utilize, and so convenient, so great, there's not a lot of reality to some of the things that's being said. You can't tell the tone. I go back to it in the book. It's like the scripture says, I would put these things in pen and paper, but I want you to see my emotions. I'm going to come tell you in person so you can truly feel my heart. Because there's no way, ultimately, today's probably the best chance I've got is being able to see you and Sister Ashley here and actually see your expressions when I'm talking to you. But if we were on a phone call, even at that, no matter how much I tried to express it in my voice tone or whatever, it's still limited. Then we demean it down to just a text or just a picture of something or what have you. So I think that, long story, short, really down to the nutshell of it, I think it's all very fake in its underlying. So that then those kids are just kind of living in this world that's not real.
So good.
So as a follow-up to that, what kind of tips do you have for parents to make themselves more approachable with their kids? Because I know most parents are like, oh yeah, my kids will talk to me. But really, like, I know when we're talking about phones and social media, our kids are seeing things, and a lot of times they're afraid to tell us what they're seeing. But like we did a podcast on pornography a few months ago, and it's all about, it's not if you see pornography, it's when you see pornography. And so what would you tell parents as far as opening the door of communication with their young people, so that when their young people are struggling with something, or maybe they're talking to someone online and they're starting to get really nervous, like what would you tell parents? Say, hey, this is a way you can make sure your kids know you're an open door of communication.
Sure. I feel like I'm somewhat of an extremist. So I'll give you my answer, and then I'll give you more of a conservative, balanced answer. Okay, so I go immediately to the scripture and it says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your arm, your leg, whatever, it's going to send you to hell, cut it off. So my extreme answer is, your 14-year-old son probably don't need a phone. If he does, he needs it so locked down that an iPhone will now enable you that it has 2 contacts, can call and text only them, no apps, no internet. Use it for what you need it to be used for, but do not allow them the openness of just, hey, here's Instagram, here's this, here's that. We put on that. The more balanced answer to that, I guess you'd say, is we've given out a list of apps that we've asked our students not to have. If you're a student of Apostolic Christian Academy, our school here, you're not allowed to have those apps. You're not allowed to have your phone at school. They put them in a bucket and they come in, and there's some mornings where I'm standing there and I have sticky notes and they're writing down their passcodes, and I go through their phones. And usually we don't do that on a Wednesday, because Wednesday night church, because usually you're going to just, all things are going to explode. But you want to get kind of to the surface of that, of what's going on. But if those apps are on their phone, I just saw this week, a friend of mine sent it to me, like Snapchat is giving now an advisory, all these videos on sex education and gender identity and all these things. It's like a full channel of all. And the last thing I want, and this is one thing that I've kind of felt a little bit of pressure for in our movement, is like my Passion for Purity series is 4 or 5 weeks, is very straightforward. I mean, every middle school boy in that classroom, their eyes are huge, and I'm being very open and very honest about the world that we're living in, to expose them and make sure that we're calling the things that are sin. And not that I don't agree with the idea that everybody is struggling, everybody's going to be exposed. In fact, I did a poll, an anonymous poll. I had them finish a sentence. I refer to it in the book. I wish my parents or pastor knew blank. You can ask my wife. I didn't set that up. There was no things like, hey, I really need you to be honest. Like, I just handed out pieces of paper as they walked in the door, and there was pens. I asked the question, gave them 10 minutes before we went into worship. And I sat in my closet that night in the floor going through those papers, literally about to weep, because I realized that the statistics that were online that I was reading, that everybody was putting out, were almost verbatim, line for line, what was in my sanctuary. And so I understand that there is a sense of statistics that have snuck in, because just because they're sitting on the pew don't mean they don't have this in their pocket. So it's like you can have, I'm not talking about parents. I've got kids that have parents in jail, drug houses, all the things, but I also have parents that have elders in the church, and both kids are struggling with it. So it doesn't go back to home environment. It goes back to the fact that there's no lines on this and there's no regulations on this. So I think it's not a coverall. It's not a blanket statement that I can say, hey, this is what's going to work for everybody. I think everybody has their own struggles. Everybody has their own issues, but I think there's almost a sense, and you guys probably know more about this. You're definitely more educated in this area, but I think we have to be careful in our movement and in our church not to normalize it, not to work so hard to make common ground between ourselves that we create like a playground for the devil. But our common ground is the cross, is the goodness and the mercy and the grace of God. That grace is a teacher, that he doesn't want you to fall over and over and over and over again, And I don't mean to over talk, but that's the line that I'm having to balance with parents, is telling them, hey, this is an issue everybody's struggling with, but we've got to flip these statistics. This can't be something that everybody's dealing with it, so the kid thinks, well, everybody's dealing with it, so I'm going to do it. That's the thing that got us years ago with fornication. Fornication's calmed down, but what's our definition of fornication as the church and as Christians? He that looketh upon a woman has committed. So if they're doing things virtually, which we know is happening, how do we regulate? We've got to make sure that we're calling those things sin, because if we're not, it's going to just be like, oh, everybody's doing it. It's the locker room talk when our age, Evan, we know it's like our dads had to talk to us about it. It's like, everybody's not having sex. Everybody's not, doing the same thing with this. I think we've got to get it to where we draw some lines. Everybody's not dealing with this. Every person's not. Yeah, because you've been tempted by it. But there's a big difference between temptation and addiction. And I think that's where we've got to make sure we show kids. We don't get faith by removing fear. We get faith by knowing that God's greater than fear. We don't get to, he says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemy. I don't get to just say, I'm going to throw these things out the door, or I'm going to not go to the mall, or I'm not going to go here, not going to go there. I've got to know that when things come at me and I'm tempted, I can look away and not be drawn away by that lesson. So that's the seesaw that I've been riding to try to make people aware, but not make everybody feel like, hey, well, everybody's doing it, so the kids are hearing it, so they're just going to fall into it and check it out, because curiosity is ultimately what pulls them into that.
One of the biggest things I feel like I hear you saying to parents, that leaders that may be watching this, is cautionary about if you're giving your young person a cell phone, that you really need to start off very small. Like, I mean, they make flip phones that you can just make calls from. Because I hear a lot of parents say, my kid needs a phone because they're going off on youth events. Like, well, just give them a phone that can make calls. I mean, if they're 12, and so, because once you open the floodgates, then I'm sure you've seen this a lot. Once you open the floodgates and it's kind of unfettered access, then when you go and try to walk it back, then it's really, really difficult once you've just said, here, have a phone, have an iPhone with all these things on it.
Yeah. And that's probably the most practical advice that I can give anybody. And that's like my son, he's 6. He has a dirt bike. The dirt bike has training wheels and a governor on it. As he gets used to it, I'm going to loosen that governor. I'm going to remove those training wheels as he learns to ride. If I put him out there on it right now, he's going to kill himself.
Yep.
There's no regard. His frontal lobe's not developed to be able to put, consequences before the actions. All that's not there. But I can take this phone, and that's what I'm trying to advise. Like, well, I can't find a flip phone, or I can't find this. They want an iPhone. Well, they can have an iPhone, but I'm going to go in, and that's what I'm trying to show them, how to go in and literally make this like the little Nokia phone we had that we put Snake on, in high school. So it's like
audio Vox, baby.
We can really kind of govern that thing down, and as we begin to trust them, we can loosen that govern up and say, hey, you can have an app, or you can have this, but I'm going to have the password, and I'm going to be able to mirror in and all those things. And so Apple's aware of it.
Yeah.
They faced so many lawsuits and dealt with so many things. They try to throw it on each social media platform, but ultimately it comes back to them in the fine print. So they have, especially the new update, they've allowed you to be able to go in and pretty much turn that thing into a paperweight that only calls one person or whatever.
Yes,
yeah, which is great too. And one of the things, like you talked about, having the anonymous submissions on what you wish your parents and pastor knew, and it's in page 31 of the book, and it hits different when you read it about apostolic kids, because for some reason the apostolic church wants to disassociate statistics from the church. And they're like, well, that's not the true apostolic church. But dude, if you did what Pastor Zach just did, you would find out. Because just to read a couple, this is, I wish my parents or pastor knew that I was struggling with anxiety and depression. I was addicted to pornography. This is different answers. This one right here hits too, how I feel towards myself, the harm I've done to myself, and the harm I'm doing to myself. I think one of the things that we can't do as the church is we cannot think that just because we're apostolic that we're not dealing with these problems.
Yeah.
And it's not just an arrogant stance, but it's a completely wrong stance to take. And I think, my wife, and she can speak more to this too, is mental health that our language has changed about mental health a lot over the years. Our understanding of mental health has changed. People think, oh, it's a hot button thing to talk about now. It's a popular thing to talk about now. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I just think we finally know how to properly address it as far as our understanding of it. So maybe, honey, you can talk a little bit about that too. And you and Zach can talk about the mental health aspect of our students today and what that looks like the state of mental health for youth today.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I love what he said. I love what you said. And you said it was kind of your extremist response, but I think it's so good as an apostolic. I think it is important as parents and leaders that we tell our kids, hey, you may know people that are struggling with pornography, or you may know people that are struggling with anxiety and depression, but that doesn't have to be your struggle. It doesn't have to be you just because it's so pervasive in our world. I think you're right. I think you've touched on a really important point that sometimes kids are like, well, it's just, this is kind of my lot in life. I'm going to struggle with this. And it's like, no, you know what? We've got something that the world doesn't have when we have God's Spirit living inside of us. And I think that's the empowerment factor with mental health, with addressing these issues, is saying, hey, you know what? Maybe you haven't struggled with it. I think that's awesome. Maybe you are struggling with it. Guess what? You don't have to live this way. You've got the power of God's Spirit. You've got all of these tools that we're giving you, and you can overcome this. So I love that response. I thought it was awesome.
Do you think, and I don't want to throw a kink or throw a curveball in here, but kind of back at you two on the idea of the book. Do you think that social media and the internet kind of world and mental health have kind of followed the same lines on the statistic of worsening, while that's becoming more and more like, I just feel like that they somewhere have a correlating, factor that what do you feel, I guess, is the cause of some of the mental health issues that we're hearing about, do you feel like they're directly related to social media or a certain part of social media?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on it earlier. Part of it is the faux relationships that we feel like we have through our phones and social media, and kids as young as, and this hits home for all of us on this podcast because we all have young children. Kids as young as 5 and 6 years old are struggling with anxiety, and that's a statistical thing. And I'm like, I'm kind of old school like you, and I'm thinking, what? Like when I was 5, like I didn't have anything to worry about. Like I'm a 5-year-old. Like where's my snacks? It's where's my toys? And I read those statistics, and we're so connected. Yeah. We're so we're connected, but we're not connected in a healthy way. And there's just an onslaught on our minds. I think it was you, honey, that said this, that we're only supposed to be connected. I was
just getting ready to say that.
Go ahead and talk about that.
There was a study that was done several years ago that I read that looked at medieval all the way up to modern times, the size of towns and townships, and it pretty much asserts, and it's pretty true as we can look around and see, that people they congregate in kind of social power dynamics. And what they were saying is that you were never designed to live in a group of more than 120 people. Because if you live in a group of 120 people, then you are the best at something. But once it becomes 121, there's one person in that group that is no longer the best. So their self-worth, their intrinsic self-worth plummets. And that's why one of the reasons that small groups and things like that work so well is because if you use those small relationship building tactics, you'll find that self-worth can still be derived. And what we'll find is that, and I was guilty of this several years ago, I had to actually delete my social media, get into the right kind of headspace mentally and emotionally, and then come back to social media, because I found myself looking at what other people were doing, especially pastors. And I was like, dude, that's not me. And your self-worth goes through the floor because we were never designed to take on that amount of information.
Yeah. Yeah. I think is, the terminology that comes to my mind, or maybe the scripture is, I'm not the Christ. I think, we're trying to go from, you scroll through and just the emotions or the information, the spiritual aspect. I'm a firm believer that everything's spiritual. I'm spirit led. I don't just get spirit when I walk into church. Like, everything I'm doing is spiritual. God, the fact of how everything's even happening on this earth right now is spiritual, because God plays a part. So in that sense, it's like, everything that I scroll through, everything I take in is affecting my spirit. It's affecting who I am. It's how I process that, how I view that. Am I going to have to pray that out? Am I going to have to really deal with how I felt about that person who posted that or said that? Whether I'm praying for a need or I'm praying for them, dear Lord, why did they just put that on the internet? Whatever the case may be, I'm going from a guy trying to capture an alligator in a trash can to so and so's emotional plea of a selfie for self-worth to so and so requesting prayer for their mom. Like, I don't think that we're physically created to be able to obtain and take in and process all of that as a human being. So I think that really has played a huge part in why people are anxious, depressed. I'm not who they are. Comparing ourselves among ourselves, I talk about that some in the book of just how it allows us to, if there's any passage that's so true about, and I've actually preached with one of those VR things on my head, it's like, it allows you to see the specks of the saints like never before. But yet we've got planks and then we become aware of everything everybody else has got going on, and it's just I think it's a thing where it's just wearing down, and you see it a lot, really in women, in young ladies. I know it's that the comparison trap, like the thing that even my wife has talked to our young ladies about, and we've dealt with over and over again. It's like, I'm not enough. I'm not, and so that feeling of depression is just always a lingering fact. If I don't post something, if I don't do something, so I don't believe that one gender can be affected and not affect the other. When they're feeling that way, then the men are going to compensate in another way. So you're seeing that even in the youth group, that if those girls are feeling down and depressed and anxious and they're doing self-harm or any of those things, the guys are going in the same way, that seesaw that's going to kind of go back and forth. I always play. It doesn't matter if it's in the church with adults. If you see, and I know this might be getting a little bit beyond what we want to address, but it's like, you see the girls start dressing a certain way or start acting a certain way. Ultimately, the men are creating that atmosphere is something, and that's why I think there's such an attack on gender identity and the family, which is a whole other ball of wax we can get into, But
well, it's really, I think as a national leader, you can really speak to this just because you travel around and have so much interaction with different churches across the country, is that it's really created a heavy burden for our churches and our local pastors to carry, because of the connectedness of our world. People will almost, and I know we're veering just a little bit, but I do think it has something to do with what we're talking about. People will log on to, other churches' social media
or
and
their
get
live stream.
Yeah, or their live stream, and they'll almost put themselves under the pastorship of, the pastor, across the country, and that creates such a burden. And then people start, and I hear this thrown around a lot, and I'm very sympathetic to this. Anyone that has been around me knows that, but they start throwing around terms like church hurt a lot. And it's all because a church may do something different or have different guidelines than the church they tune in on live stream every week and follow their social media and are obsessed with all their leaders. And the burden on the local church is so great because we are so connected with what, everyone is doing. And I mean, it's created this whole just dynamic for pastors and leaders that really we shouldn't ever had to have been dealing with in the first place.
And it's funny because you're talking to the guy who has helped build arguably probably one of the most viewed apostolic live streams in the country.
Yeah, but you guys don't want to pastor other people's saints. Yeah.
It's true, but it is a thing. I think that comparison goes on all levels, and it really blurs the line between what I believe is, you have biblical standards, spiritual leadership standards, and personal standards, and those things can never work in reverse. And like that, those spiritual standards, it's like the things that you're looking at my church, I'm looking at your church, Joe Blow's looking at this church or that church. It's like we can be in church leadership trying to lead people and be falling into the same trap a 13 or 14-year-old girl is scrolling through Instagram.
Yes.
That's good, bro.
That's good preaching right there. I don't even know trying to preach.
What works in my town is not going to work in your town. And and I hate to say it, but even those pastoral standards that I make, Pastor Carpenter makes, that's not something I can impose on you. And it gets down to that, but that's the comparison thing, and we're not careful. We sit there and we and ourselves are dealing with mental, we're thinking on things that are causing anxiety. Am I enough as a pastor? Did I preach good enough? Did I sing good enough? Did I do things right? And all the while, it's like, hey, I've called you to hear. Like, that's not you. That's like, I'm with you. I gave you that sermon for today. You can just kind of feel that struggle between curiosity and conviction. Can I be what they are? Am I doing what they, and I think all of it goes back to a comparison trap that we can't fall into.
Do we want to talk about church milk?
I don't. Do you really want to?
Well, I don't know if I want to or not, because it's so true though what he's saying, because then, recently there was a large
oh no.
How do I phrase this?
He's always got to be controversial.
That's what gets the views, girl. That's what gets the views. No, but honestly though, there was a post on there that was pretty controversial. Yeah. And sometimes they're controversial, but this one was pretty incredibly controversial.
Yeah.
But it had exactly to do with what we're talking about right now is those standards on those different levels and letting a pastor be the pastor of his church. And like you're saying, not comparing, not looking out literally across the country, but because we live in a beach town. And so it's a much different cultural context than Maryville in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains. And so there's certain things that our church may do that is a protective measure, that is a spiritual standard for our church, that's going to be a lot different up there just because we're dealing with a much different culture. And so to compare, and Brother Zach already said it once, but it's so true, to compare yourself among yourself is unwise for multiple reasons. But that's one of those things is that we can't fall into that trap.
What I feel like I've heard you say, in maybe the leaders at your church, the message I feel that they convey quite a bit is about buying into your local church, and that there's nothing more important than what you're doing at
their church does incredible at.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. That's yes. And that's why you guys have such an incredible church, is that you have, said there's nothing more important than being involved in your local church. And I feel like that curbs that. If we can convey that attitude to our young people and to our parents and to members of our church, that the most important thing is what's happening in the local church, and buying into that, then we can curb some of this social media comparison, attending other churches through social media kind of.
I have a question too, because this is probably the perfect person to ask, right? So you have a successful church, and I love that he's like, we're going way off script here. Like, this has nothing to do with what I said yesterday.
This is our. This is what we do.
He's the perfect person to ask, because we just did a podcast on navigating organizational dynamics, and one of the things that we talked about was focusing on your church being a part of an organization, but not to the detriment of your church. Bishop Carpenter is he's the general superintendent of the ALJC. Pastor Zach is he's the youth president of the ALJC. Brother Erickson serves in a national or international capacity for the ALJC, and the list goes on. How do you navigate that as a student pastor of a church, focusing on your church, but also being a blessing and focusing on the organization as well? Like, how does that, because I just had a conversation with a minister at our church yesterday about this same thing. How do we do both, if that makes sense?
Sure. I think I go back to what Sister Ashley just said. I think you've got to make it about the local church. It's not about, the best example I can be to a youth president or a youth pastor in leading them is show them what to do in the local church. It's not conference based. It's not camp based. It's day to day. Go in. Here's some series. Here's some stuff you can use to try to lead your kids. How do you connect with your parents? It's not about us getting together and having a powwow or having a conference necessarily. Those things are great. And if there's anybody that's an advocate for I'm doing what I hate. I'm not demeaning one good thing to make another good thing right. Both are needed. Small group, large group, all those things. But ultimately, that's the way I try to do it. And if I ever feel myself getting to the place where one has to suffer for the other one to be successful, that's the moment I'll begin to kind of step back. And the only way I can do the national is with a team. I delegate like crazy. I get calls all the time. I'm, man, how you doing what you're doing? I'm like, I'm not really doing it. I'm just, kind of handing it off. There's when I went into the situation with the Crusaders, with the assemblies, to lead that, I would not do it without certain people on board, because I knew that I couldn't give all of that. So I knew there was people that felt the same way I felt about it. Brother Anthony McCool, him and I, he does so much stuff that people have no clue about. Like, I can't praise him enough for what he does for that. And so I couldn't do it if I didn't allow there to be a team. And that is the same way that we work on the local. So I couldn't do what I do if I didn't have Brother Erickson, Brother Nolan, Pastor Carpenter, and us being able to share the responsibility. And ultimately, our church wouldn't be what it is, the same way the organization is. So all those things enable us to be able to do that, of having the team to kind of work off of and to work through. And so that's one thing that I'm pushing. Anytime people ask me, I'm like, hey, try to build a team. Everybody don't have to be a chief. It's not all about me getting behind the pulpit. As much as I love preaching, and I believe it's called of God to do it. It's God sent, and God uses it. Like what I'll do today behind the desk, talking to a student, what I did last night in my car, sitting next to a graduated, a freshman in college, talking to him about some stuff he's struggling with. I'm making as much impact, and it's going to take a team of people in order to be able to grow things to the size, that we want them to be. And so I think that's one thing that our movement struggles with is we want everybody wants to be kind of the head of something and not I don't mean that bad, but I think there's a lot of cities that if all the people that are pastors would come together and work together, we could do something great instead of a bunch of smaller impact things. But that's a whole nother, you're talking about really deviating, we could really deviate there. But that's the only way that's the only way I can personally do it is to take simply what I'm doing and just be an example, because the local church is what it's all about.
That's so good.
Well, just to like recap what he said, and I think bringing it back around, and then whatever you feel like we
I
need
just
to
have
do.
one more question, then I'm done.
Yeah, I think what I heard you saying a lot too is that personal connection is so important. If we're gonna kind of combat some of these issues with social media and phones, it's more than just preaching from the pulpit, which is great and it has its place and it's amazing. It's more than doing a like scroll through series on Instagram of how to combat social media. It's like you said, reaching out with what they're lacking, that personal connection, sitting in a car, talking with them, making some time, playing a game of basketball, doing something with them in person and opening up that conversation, opening up that discussion to where they can have a real connection and be able to talk about, hey, this is what I'm struggling with. This is what I'm dealing with, and connecting with them on a personal level can really bridge that gap and take some of these statistics that we're reading and, just start, slashing those by the power of God's Spirit and through connecting with these kids.
It's so good. Brother Zach, before I ask my final question, do you have anything you want to add before we jump off this podcast?
No, I appreciate you being on there. I want to say thank you to anybody that's bought the book, and I pray it's been helpful. I am working on a kind of a small group series. It's just a quick 4 or 5 minute max that just kind of opens us up to each chapter. So it'll take us through each chapter, all 10 chapters, and so I hope to have that uploaded here in the next few weeks. So
awesome. That's exactly what I was going to ask you, is if we're getting some type of sermon series, small group, because that's perfect. I really believe that Brother Zach Hammond has spearheaded a much needed conversation. Curiosity versus conviction. Pick it up. We'll have the link below. We'll also have the link to Proverbs, the daily devotional. I'm picking up my copy today. I'll be ordering that. He's got that. Yep. So mine's coming in the mail. And so, man, just thank you so much for being on. Yes. And we appreciate all the wisdom that you shared with us today.
And thank you guys. It's an honor, and I pray everything there in your part of the world just keeps going forward. And again, I can't say enough about what you guys are doing. Thank you for not only this, but everything you're doing for our movement.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Think on These Things podcast. You'll catch us next time. We got some other podcasts coming up. They're going to be some fun topics, controversial topics, because, controversy brings the viewers. So we're looking forward to it. And as always, you've been watching the Biblos Network.